Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I am really excited today to be talking about a topic that has been brewing and percolating for many years, many decades, in fact. We're going to be talking about containerization in New York City, where I was born and raised, and where we have struggled for a long, long time in managing trash and recycling. We will be talking about why there is such little containerization in New York City today, what efforts are being underway to start to containerize more of it, some really exciting pilots that have just started in the past handful of months, and the outlook for the future. We'll, of course, be diving a little bit into the history of why we've gotten here in the first place. So with that, let's jump on in. First, let's look at a few of the important numbers to keep in mind as we think about how New York City has gone about managing trash and recycling, the really difficult task of managing trash and recycling for such a big city that is so dense. And to kind of rewind and think about it, back in 1900, at the start of the 20th century, there were 3.4 million New Yorkers in the New York City kind of proper, much bigger metropolitan area as a whole. Today, it's a city of 8.4 million people, and 14 million tons of trash and recycling are generated each year, of solid waste each year. That is a whole lot of material. That works out to about 12,000 tons a day, or 24 million pounds, if my math is right. Never my strong suit, but it is a whole lot of material, and it wasn't always uncontainerized. It is collected in plastic bags today, typically black bags for trash and clear plastic bags for recycling, or clear transparent blue bags for recycling, but that wasn't always the case. Rewinding to the 1950s and prior, trash and later recycling were collected in metal bins. Pretty loud, clanky metal bins. They were a sore spot for people. One of the biggest issues that are most frequently reported to city agencies, regardless of which city, are noise complaints. And folks, especially thinking about the packaging we had back in that day, a lot of glass, a lot of metal, knocking around in metal bins was pretty noisy. In the 1960s, during one particular strike in the Department of Sanitation of New York, where containers stopped being picked up for a brief period of time, people started resorting to bagging trash in plastic bags. And they found that it was much quieter. And during that period, Department of Sanitation of New York decided we should actually develop a pilot. And in 1969, they studied whether trash should be picked up in paper bags versus plastic bags, thinking that lacking containerization and being in a bag of some sort would better satisfy people's preferences for quieter trash pickup, which I don't blame them early in the morning for. I lived above a restaurant a couple years after college where when they dumped glass bottles and aluminum cans, early in the morning was a really loud, definitely would wake you up endeavor. Not ideal for sure. Department of Sanitation found that plastic bags, of course, due to their moisture barriers, more improved moisture barriers relative to paper, was the kind of preferred option of the two. They also claimed that it really enabled them to speed up collection, which makes sense when you think about it. If you can just grab a bunch of plastic bags and toss them into a truck, that's going to take less time than individually picking up, pretty big, hulky metal containers and tipping material and replacing it back, at the foot of the building or at the curb while you're doing so. They estimated that it was able to speed up collection about 20%. And this flags one important variable for us to think about when we start to think about how New York City might be starting to containerize more material. Today, only 10% of New York City waste is estimated to be containerized. That is a really small portion. And of course, when we think about, picking up containerized material, opening up a lock to get that material on the part of the transportation or the DSNY crew or the private hauler that's coming to pick up the material, even though it might incrementally be adding only a few seconds to undo a lock, lift a lid, and bring material out of the container, cumulatively over such a big city, that really adds up. So we need to be thinking about what impact does that have on a route. If you're going to be slower over the course of, your morning route and only be able to pick up from 800 properties where you used to be able to pick up 1,000 within the same time frame, those routes will likely have to be adjusted. But of course, just one of many, many variables that folks will really need to be thinking about. The reasons why we're, of course, thinking about containerizing all of this waste that used to be, and then for the past 30, 40 years, 50, 60 years, hasn't been is due to a number of reasons. Of course, we know walking around New York City, if you live there or have visited there or are from there and no longer like me, you know that it's pretty unsightly, that, it's no fun to walk past mountains of garbage bags and trash bags and, recycling, quote unquote, bags containing material on the sidewalk. It's unsightly. It has odors often. Is a huge attraction for rodents. Very importantly, a lot of this interest to containerize waste comes from that rodent angle. And of course, it also really importantly is an ADA accessibility issue, often with those mountains of trash bags being pretty wily and often blocking the right of way for folks who might be walking or using mobility assisted devices to kind of enter the streetscape and enter the right of way from a sidewalk or in and out of buildings as well. One of the reasons why this has proved so challenging to change is the intimate relationship between New York City and alleyways, and frankly, their lack of alleys. While we have a lot of media and kind of films and TV that shows, superheroes swooping through alleys, or, cop shows with chases down alleys, there are very few alleys in New York City. There are more in the outer boroughs, certainly, but especially in Manhattan, there are very, very few. In fact, there are only 6 in Manhattan, and only one where all of those TV and movies have been shot, Cortlandt Alley in Chinatown, which is somewhere I am sure you could traipse by and never notice when walking around, but it's kind of a funny New York factoid. But the reason for the lack of alleys was actually really intentional. Back in 1811, when the commissioner's plan was being designed by folks in Albany to design the New York City street grid, or at least above Houston Street in Lower Manhattan, the majority of Manhattan, they thought that because there are so many east-west streets that bisect the long north-south avenues in New York, that there really wouldn't be as much of a need for alleys as there, were in other cities at the time. I think this, logically, when thinking about the population growth that we might have, even though that probably would have been hard to imagine, might have given someone pause. A lot of people also point to the reality that eliminating alleys enables real estate developers, many of whom were involved in designing that city grid plan, to squeeze out more square footage for their buildings. Estimates range from 10 to 20% more square footage was able to kind of be squeezed out of those parcels in New York City due to removing alleys. Once zoning started to be created in the 20th century, in the early 1900s, some properties, especially, for instance, between theaters and hotels might need to have alleys created for fire issues. But a lot of those eventually ended up being turned into more formal streets. So we don't even for those few alleys that were created after the fact, they don't operate as alleys today, kind of interestingly enough. So when we think about all of this material, 14 million tons of material a year, how are we picking that up in the city that has very few alleys to its name? We in DC, here where I am, have lots of alleys. Very few streets don't have alleys. They might be big or small, might require trucks of different sizes to get down, but that is never an issue you generally confront. Here you do. Certainly there are a lot of multifamily and business properties that have loading docks, but it is not always required, and it certainly is a real patchwork of places that have them or not. And even if they do have a loading dock, ones that are big enough to contain all the trash and recycling that their residents generate. Certainly is kind of a crapshoot whether that works out. So when we think about what kinds of buildings might need to start containerizing material, we're not so much thinking about single family homes. Where those do exist in New York City, it's much less dense. They likely are in that 10% of material that's being containerized today in smaller bins fit for a single family home. But we're really going to be thinking about multifamily buildings, commercial properties like businesses, and the public space, those litter bins you see on the corner. One interesting evolution that started in 2021 was the consideration of solid waste plans that would have to be submitted by multifamily buildings of a certain size. They were looking at buildings that had at least 150 units and requiring them to submit plans that detailed a lot of nuances about how they plan to manage trash and recycling, not unlike how the city of Austin in Texas does, or lots of communities in the US and elsewhere. One of the key pieces of this proposed plan, though, would be for a multifamily building to have to tell DSNY and confirm proactively that 100% of their solid waste was being containerized in a rodent-proof, leak-proof bin. Certainly one important piece of the puzzle for kind of expediting and starting to gain some momentum around containerization of material, even if only for new multifamily buildings or multifamily buildings that were having substantial major renovations underway. We know, of course, that those smaller and older buildings are going to be the toughest ones to bring along of the current housing stock and building stock. But when we think about those containerization systems and the bins or dumpsters or roll-offs that they might use, there's a lot of considerations that are at play. Of course, the ones that are inside of a building are, probably more flexible than ones that are outside of a building where a lot of that material is being stored today. We're going to have to be thinking, or we as in kind of that solid waste community, DSNY is going to have to be thinking about what should those buildings be able to use, how big the maximum size and volume of a container, how high, if it's on the right of way, on the sidewalk or adjacent to the sidewalk in the street, can it be waist high? Can it be, I'm 5'7", could it be 5'7"? Could it be 6 feet tall, taller than maybe most people walking around? Can it be 20 feet tall? How tall should a containerized trash and recycling kind of receptacle be? Should it be able to open only from the kind of front and swing forward like a gate? And what implication do those swinging doors have into the right of way? We know, of course, hinges and locks and closures tend to break and something could open unintentionally. Or should they only be able to open from the top and kind of flip upwards? So someone would have to reach in and pull out that material, which ends some time and difficulty and friction for the collection workers that are picking up the material, whether it would be the Department of Sanitation in New York picking up that residential material from multifamily or single family, or a private hauler picking up material from a business. Not only are we going to be thinking about that, but of course, how thick of, heavy plastic or metal needs to be used, how rodent proof, how leak proof, knowing that of course solid waste can be pretty wet and moist, especially any component that has food, whether it's organics being collected for recycling at an anaerobic digestion facility or a composting facility, or in our general refuse stream today. One of the other really interesting pieces, I think, that kind of harkens back to that consideration about time and how fast someone can collect material is how they're secured. Is it a padlock with a physical key? Is it a lock that you need to plug some numbers into? How is someone going to secure that and also get into it when they need to pick it up? One of the other variables that I think is really fascinating for us to think about for containerization, and this is something that is not unique to New York, that we all struggle with in communities where we have containerized trash and recycling collection today, and that it's a static program, is what is the ratio of trash versus recycling receptacles that we should have? Should it all be the same and the distinction remains by the color of plastic bag that you use? Or should you have dedicated containerized systems for trash versus recycling? And when you think about kind of that ratio, today there is a residential diversion rate in New York of 17%. Should that be representative of the amount of containerized trash versus recycling receptacles that might be housed on the streetscape? Or should it be more ambitious with a bigger portion of material being for recyclables? We also, of course, have to think about kind of that diversion rate is by weight, but of course, we think about collection of trash and recycling in cubic yards or in volume. So of course, it's not an exact translation, and we know recycling takes up more space. It's lighter relative to the volume it takes up than trash as well. One of the pieces that I think is going to be a big enabling factor to containerization in New York, and I am really excited to see how New York City decides to address this in partnership with the Department of Sanitation and New York City Department of Transportation, is potentially placing a lot more of these systems like they do in Europe where a parking spot might normally be. We know that, of course, a lot of cities, both in Europe and elsewhere, that have containerization for trash and recycling, not within a multifamily building, but outside of it, that's shared among different properties, takes place next to a bike lane, next to moving traffic lanes, between that and the sidewalk. And in New York City, we have about 3 million parking spots today. About 6,100, about 6,100 were removed in 2018 to 2019 to make room for streeteries or bike lanes, or you have it. It's a hotly contended issue, of course, to remove a parking spot, in and of itself, let alone what it goes to. But that is one lever that I think can definitely be pulled to accommodate more space for trash and recycling and composting increasingly as that rolls out across the community in New York as well. And that kind of composting angle has definitely been one big piece of the containerization push. Now, Department of Sanitation of New York is providing composting services curbside to 3.3 million New Yorkers. That's a pretty big portion. 3.3 million out of its total 8.4 is not, anything to sneeze at, largely in Queens and Manhattan, but they've definitely been expediting that curbside composting rollout again in recent months after it suffered some budget shortfalls over the pandemic. So exciting to see that come back is a big piece. But of course, there are residential pilots underway. I want to say between 44th Street and 46th Street in New York City to containerize material unrelated to organics necessarily, and just for that kind of core refuse and recyclables. It's just one of a constellation of pilots that are underway today. While containerization has been a really big sticking point for decades in New York, it's really started to ramp up in recent years, starting with de Blasio's administration between 2014 and 2021. When Eric Adams, the current mayor, ran for election the year before last, or last year in 2021, it was a big part of his campaign, for sure, something that came up on a somewhat regular basis. After he took office in January of 2022, just a number of months ago, definitely was something that was a big focus of his new administration in the Department of Sanitation, led by Jessica Tisch. In fact, in April of 2022, they announced one of the biggest efforts that New York has in recent years had to containerize material, called the Clean Curb Pilot Program. And it's really aiming to help commercial entities and business improvement districts in particular start to containerize material, both from kind of that public litter, kind of curbside litter bin for trash and recycling, as well as material that's being generated by businesses within that business improvement district. And to do so in a rodent-proof, leak-proof container of some sort, flexible as to what that looks like. That bid or business is allowed to kind of explore what would look, preferable to them, but would be approved by Department of Sanitation and the New York City Department of Transportation. Someone basically applies to that program, or I should say an entity applies to that program, and if they're selected, they have to notify the adjacent properties as well as their community board, and then kind of talk through the specifics of what they plan to install. And they're the ones responsible for purchasing, installing, and maintaining those containerized systems. The first few that have unfolded, not everyone that applied was selected, but a number were. And a couple of them have been in some pretty key places, including Times Square, who purchased 7 bins. Their business improvement district purchased 7 containerized systems for trash and recycling at a cost of about $7,500 per container from a company based in Brooklyn called City Bin. There's been another bid in Brooklyn, the Montague bid, that installed similar container systems, and both have had really resoundingly positive feedback, both from residents and patrons and passersby, as well as businesses themselves, really from kind of both the community and the private sector, have really been appreciative of the better containerized system, as well as employees of the bid. They've noted that there's far less breakage of bags, leading to spilled trash in the right of way or on the sidewalk, as well as much less incidents of folks littering material, because when they walk past, of course, a stack of plastic bags, people are much more likely to just toss their coffee cup on top of that pile, as opposed to seek out a containerized system or a bin at the corner. But as I mentioned, not every bid or business that applied to the Clean Curb pilot was accepted. One of the ones that was unfortunately not accepted in this initial round was the Soho bid. And they've gone ahead and regardless start to pursue and start to design a containerized system that they would want to move forward with if and when their time comes. I'm sure it is not too long of a wait with the emphasis that the Adams administration has been placing on containerization. But they found that when looking for containerized systems for trash and recycling in their neighborhood in Soho, they couldn't find something that was aesthetically pleasing enough for them. The containerization systems in Times Square are pretty functional, kind of neutral browns, and look pretty heavy duty. Soho, perhaps as their reputation might ensue, is looking for something that's a little bit crisper and sleeker of a design. And it's exciting to see that even though they weren't selected, they are really aggressively figuring out and trying to pursue a system that they would like to have in the future, and to be really prepared and in anticipation of that eventual containerization program that they would be able to participate in. One of the other exciting efforts that are underway is a neighborhood grant challenge program that's really targeting underserved communities and improving cleanliness, of which containerization is a really big part. It's not limited to containerization necessarily, but I think that's definitely kind of the core of the spirit of the grant program that a lot of applicants will likely be focusing on. And that's a program that launched this year that'll have $1.3 million in funding dedicated to it in fiscal year 2023, with each individual application being able to pitch a project up to $100,000 to support cleanliness in their community. This really harkens back and underscores Eric Adams, the mayor's vision for containerization and cleanliness having a really key connection to environmental justice, knowing that a lot of communities in New York and neighborhoods that suffer from higher incidence of litter and less consistent collection are consistently underserved communities. This is one of many efforts that have had that environmental justice angle intimately woven and folded into them. New York City Public Housing Authority, NYCHA, for instance, has been focusing meaningfully on trash and recycling in recent years. They have had a rash of pretty critical solid waste failures and fires in their properties, with unfortunately every once in a while a casualty. In 2020, in late 2020, I believe an 8-year-old unfortunately was among those people who unfortunately were affected by that and didn't survive a fire in a public housing facility due to a backed up trash chute that ignited. So a lot of solid waste challenges that are going on in New York City public housing, containerization being a big one of them. In New York City public housing's 335, I should say New York City's housing authority, in their public housing developments have 335 properties where more than almost 180,000 households live, a population bigger than the city of Boston. It's really an enormous population, and unfortunately much of their trash and recycling isn't containerized today. Not only is containerization being explored, but also baling to condense that material, especially cardboard, on site. But of course, not only are we thinking about kind of those core containers for trash and recycling, there's also been some interesting exploration of pneumatic waste systems, which New York City has been really kind of a front leader in exploring in the US. It's not something that's common today in the United States, but is increasingly common elsewhere and in a lot of cities in Europe, both big and small, now using pneumatic waste conveyance systems to kind of use vacuum pressure to compress and convey trash and recycling and organics, kind of all three streams, both within multifamily buildings and businesses and institutional properties, as well as kind of among neighborhoods to bigger collection points. 20% of households in Stockholm have pneumatic waste conveyance systems. In a lot of cities in Asia, it's being used within big multifamily housing complexes and not necessarily at the city scale. But New York City has been really kind of open to experimenting with them, in particular in Roosevelt Island and in Hudson Yards more recently. The Roosevelt Island system has been around for a number of years and was in fact the only neighborhood in New York City that during the acute kind of storm and immediate aftermath of Hurricane Sandy was able to have solid waste collection kind of proceed on as normal. So an interesting kind of resilience and natural disaster angle for that potential solution to better containerize and transport material that would be generated in really high density neighborhoods and buildings in and of itself. But this is the really early days for a kind of energized, refound push of containerization in New York City. The Department of Sanitation of New York, in conjunction with their economic development entities, have contracted McKinsey to do a $4 million study of containerization solutions and feasibility and kind of rollout and how that would work just last month. And will be going on for about 20 weeks. So I'm really eager, like many, to see what their conclusions are and what their proposals would be for moving forwards with city scale solutions for containerization. But really heartening to see a number of pilot programs underway in the meantime to get the ball rolling and gain some momentum there. For sure, without a doubt needing to ramp that up, but exciting to see after so many decades where folks have been unable to kind of move the needle on containerization, both from a kind of odor and aesthetic angle, as well as really importantly, a rodent angle, is one to watch. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. As always, please feel free to leave questions, thoughts, comments under the video here on waste360.com, as well as give me a shout on Twitter at @CharDryzen or Instagram at CharRecycles. I'm glad we could dive into the topic of containerization in New York today. It's one near and dear to my heart, and I'm really curious to hear what you think. Thanks so much.